Welcome to this Tutor to You Sociology topic video looking at global development, focusing on industrialization and development. The first question we need to answer is, what is industrialization and how does it impact on development? Well, in terms of global development, industrialization is the process of moving from a largely agricultural production base to industrial production. The use of machinery and technology to improve the amount and types of products that a nation can produce. It's usually accompanied by urbanization as people move to towns and cities, where industrialization usually occurs. The increase in production requires a larger workforce, and so towns and cities grow around the industrial base of a nation. There are several different types of industrialization that are commonplace in developing nations, and these include the development of tourism industries, for example in the Caribbean, North Africa and Southeast Asia. There is also the growth of agribusiness, large-scale production of primary goods, fruits, vegetables, coffee, tea, rice, which is then exported. Now these are often located in parts of Southeast Asia, Africa and South America. Finally, there is the development of manufacturing. And in the early stages of development, this is usually things like textiles. But as nations develop, they move into electronics, computing, and newer forms of technology. There is also the development of services, for example, IT services and call centres, being outsourced to nations that have developed those areas of expertise. The process of industrialisation occurred in Western Europe during the course of the Industrial Revolution, with at first the development of textile mills and the development of more innovative methods of production such as assembly lines, and this led to the production of heavier machinery. At each stage of industrialisation, profits were invested into new forms of technology that would increase output, and this drove economic growth in the West. But in recent years, many Western nations have undergone a process of deindustrialisation as this manufacturing is moved to the developing world, and Western economies are increasingly dominated by services such as finance and banking. However, the model of industrialisation that is applied to the developing world has its roots in the Industrial Revolution, and it is largely based upon Western models of development, which, unsurprisingly, has its critics. Both modernisation and neoliberal theorists take a positive view of urbanisation. Modernisation theorists such as Rostow see the process of industrialisation as being key to moving through the stages of modernisation, from rural agricultural production to an era of mass consumption. In the early stages, any surpluses are invested into technology to improve production. Alternatively, this can be achieved through aid or borrowing, much like any business does to try and expand its production. As nations develop, they generate more profit, reinvest these back into newer technologies and move through Rostow's stages of modernisation, ultimately becoming like Western nations, large service sector economies based on mass consumption. Neoliberals also view industrialisation as desirable and a driver for economic growth. However, rather than give aid, they prefer nations to operate free trade policies and encourage investment from overseas. They argue that Western TNCs have the expertise to help the process of industrialisation by setting up production in the developing world. And this has been the dominant way of thinking in terms of industrialisation. Yet other theorists would argue that this actually does more harm than good. Dependency theorists such as Hoogveld would argue that the process of industrialisation benefits TNCs more than it does the citizens of a nation. They suggest that transnational corporations are a form of neo-colonialism, replacing the colonial rule of nation states such as the UK, France and Belgium. And instead of aiding the process of development, these corporations are motivated by profit, and so they establish industrial infrastructures in the developing world that will enable them to cut costs in comparison to production in the West. This gives them cheaper labour, access to valuable resources, and the power to influence employment legislation. Dependency theorists will see this as a form of exploitation, particularly as developing nations are forced into this path if they accept aid when developing their own infrastructures through structural adjustment policies. Industrialisation can take different forms, with tourism, agribusiness development and manufacturing the most common forms. Tourism has increased in the era of globalisation, with many people wanting to visit more exotic locations than in the past. This helps developing nations to develop, as big hotel chains will invest in coastal regions and islands in order to attract Western tourism. However, this is not without its problems. It imposes Western norms and values onto different cultures, and this can cause tension. And often, the employment that is available for these TNCs is low paid and seasonal. Agribusiness development transforms small rural agricultural holdings and applies Western expertise in production to increase the yields of primary products that are produced. However, as the demand for these goods is set by the West, increasing the supply will actually drive down the prices that farmers receive, as Western markets have more choice of suppliers. This has the potential to lead to overproduction in order to maintain revenue, and ultimately this leads to desertification from the overuse of land. Finally, manufacturing is a growth industry, in part because Western TNCs move production from the West, where there are higher wages and more employment legislation, to the developing world, where wages are low, regulations are scarce, and access to raw materials is plentiful. Industrialisation, like many other processes within development, impacts on other areas of society. Most notably, the growth of industrialisation has had a negative impact on the environment. Increased pollution, desertification and deforestation in order to build manufacturing premises and the required urbanisation of areas around those causes environmental harm. But this is not new. In the West, many of the processes of industrialisation had similar effects, although industrialisation in the West was far less rapid than in developing nations, and so the effects are multiplied. The process of industrialisation also impacts on education, with higher levels of skills required in order to work for TNCs. It also impacts on employment, with people moving from informal sectors and subsistence farming to formal employment, usually for large corporations, which are often argued to be exploitative. That concludes this Tutor to You Sociology topic video looking at global development, focusing on industrialisation and development. Thanks for watching.